Welcome to Ascend's Women in Leadership series. Today we're talking to Cristina Cordova. I am so excited for our conversation. Cristina is awesome. She has a wealth of experience building teams at some of the best companies, including most recently, she was the head of partnerships and platform at Notion. She has spent a long time at Stripe and has seen so much of the company's growth and built teams there as the head of corporate card and treasury at Stripe. She built Stripe's business development org. She now advises and invests in early stage startups. So really, really impressive background. Cristina and I met a few years ago, and I was blown away by her sharp insights and also her ability to make others just feel instantly at ease. That is such a unique and powerful combination. And so today we're going to get to learn more about how Cristina does it. We're going to dive into how she builds a magnetic brand, how she rallies stakeholders, and about mistakes. Like how does she bounce back from mistakes? This is something that we don't normally talk about, but we should. So it's going to be a really fun conversation. I'm Shivani. I am the CEO and founder of Ascend. We offer an online leadership program for women. What inspired me to start Ascend was I used to be in your shoes. So I learned how to advocate for myself, how to get buy-in from stakeholders, how to lead my team as I was moving up in management, all by making a ton of mistakes. Some guidance, probably just a lot of blowups. And so I wanted to create the leadership program I wish I had access to when I was making that transition into management. Our mission at Ascend is to elevate more women into leadership. That's a big way we create the change that we need to see in today's world. And we're doing it. We've had women from companies like Google, Slack, Peloton, DoorDash come out of the program feeling much more confident, getting promoted, moving up faster in their careers. So much of the program is curated by senior leaders who have been in your shoes, who've done it all. I really believe we need to have more open and honest conversations around what it takes to be successful as leaders. And that's why we host these fireside chats. I am so excited today to talk to Cristina. Cristina, thank you so much for joining us today. It's truly an honor.
Yeah, of course. Happy to be here.
Thank you. So today, Cristina and I are going to chat for about 30 minutes about all the topics that are on our minds. And then we're going to dive into Q&A. So throughout the conversation, feel free to add any questions that you want Cristina to cover in the Q&A icon that's in the bottom right of your screen. So the Q&A icon is bottom and right of your screen. You can add questions and upvote anything. And then we'll dive into as many as possible. And we want this conversation to be fun and valuable for you. So if anything really resonates with you, you're like, yeah, that is super helpful, or I've been there, throw it in the chat. We want to hear from you. And this is an experience that we're all going to go through together. And as a reminder, change your settings in the chat to panelists and attendees so everyone can see your conversation and everyone gets to benefit from what you're sharing with us. So Cristina, let's dive into it. I want to start learning more about you. And first, let's go beyond the LinkedIn profile. Can you share more insights about your career journey and how you thought about the different moves that you made in your career?
Yeah, sure. So maybe I can start at the beginning. So when I was in college, I went to college assuming that I wanted to be a lawyer. And so I studied political science because that seemed like kind of the natural path. And then I took this class my junior year called Intro to American Law. And more than just like really disliking the professor, I also realized in that course that it can take a really long time to actually get one of these like super high profile cases in like civil rights or other things that can like really make an impact. And at that point in my life, I felt like particularly impatient. I think I am still very impatient, which maybe explains some of my career decisions. But generally, I looked at that and said, like that feels like it's moving too slow to me to like, spend 3 years at law school and then, however many years as an associate at a law firm to be able to do something finally like impactful. So at that point I said, well, I was very lucky to be able to go to Stanford, and in Palo Alto, there were a bunch of folks who were, starting to work at startups, and I had like never even heard of like a startup before. And so I had a friend who was interning at a startup in Palo Alto, and she was about to go abroad for the like next year. And so she was like, oh, we're looking for someone to maybe take my place. Would you be interested? And so I went in and I interviewed, and I actually I worked throughout college. I gave up a paid job to take an unpaid job at a startup, so much so because I was like, well, why would anyone at a startup, like a tech company, hire me? Because I have like no tech background at all, and I'm in my senior year of college, right? So I should probably figure this out. And so ended up working at a company called Tapulous for the entire like senior year of college. And they basically built like mobile games like Tap Tap Revenge for the iPhone, which was like Dance Dance Revenge, effectively for the phone. And I was doing a bunch of things there that I don't think anyone of my age and experience, like, should have been doing. I ended up doing some kind of like pitch to like Warner Brothers to get them to advertise in the game. And I was just like shocked that they were like letting me do this kind of stuff, right? And, I think it was pretty classic of most startups. They just don't have a lot of like business or like non-technical people in the early days. And so they're like, oh, great, like you can like help with this. And that's what I did. And I think out of that experience, I realized, wow, I'm given so much responsibility. Like maybe this is what all of tech is like. And so I ended up applying to work at Google, which was, like the best company to work for, right, at that time. And when I got the job offer, it was kind of one of those things where they don't really tell you like what you're going to be working on, because they have these like gigantic programs for like new grads. And there was a computer science class I decided to take my senior year so I could like, prove my worth in the tech industry. And I basically met someone who was starting a company in the course, and they were like, hey, would you be able to help us out with some business stuff? And I ended up working on that startup for the month between when I graduated and when I went to Google. And again, like had a lot of fun, was doing a bunch of things I had no business doing, et cetera. And then eventually decided to take that full-time job and go to Google. And within a few weeks, I realized that I was not a big tech company person, and that coming into a big company, I was doing like a very narrow set of work, and that I could like drop dead the next day and Google would be perfectly fine without me. And that's the kind of company you want to build, right? Like you want to build a company where like no one person has this like crazy outsized impact. But that, eventually was, something I realized wasn't for me. So from there, I actually went back to the startup that I worked at for that 1 month, spent about 2.5 years there, started doing what was called like business development at the time, which was primarily working on like content and distribution startups, or not startups, partnerships rather. And in that time, I realized that it was something that I was really good at. It was something that the company needed. And I just, hustled my way through figuring out what that role was and what it could accomplish for the business. So I did that for 2.5 years. And then I happened to meet the CEO of Stripe at a barbecue in Palo Alto, and realized in talking with him that he actually lived in the house next to my office at the startup I was working at, and was kind of like annoyed with the calls and the noise of the business and all that kind of stuff. And eventually, we became friends, and I got to learn more about what Stripe was doing. And he asked me if I wanted to join the company. And at that point, I just didn't really really understand how my historical work would translate to that company. So at the time I was working for more of like a media mobile startup, and Stripe was very much this like developer product for commerce businesses. And so I was just like, like how does this translate to that? And I ended up meeting the COO at the time, and learning a little bit more about the business and what the possible partnerships were. And it was like new and interesting. And I thought every single person I met there was super smart. So I primarily joined the company because I thought everyone was really smart. I thought worst case, this will be 2 years at a company with smart people who are building interesting things. And best case turns out to be a really big company. And I guess in the case of Stripe, turned out to be best case scenario. So I ended up joining as the first BD person there, built out the BD team, worked on a lot of brand new products. Stripe didn't have product managers until we were like maybe 200, 250 people. So I really liked working on kind of the intersection between business and product. And that was really exciting to me. And then like all companies, as they grow, your role starts to become more narrow over time. So partnerships in BD became less about product and more about just working with those external partners and the connection to the business, which was fine, but it was like less intriguing to me. So I ended up becoming what Stripe calls like a business lead, which basically is something that is kind of like a GM of a business unit. And we were working on building a couple of new financial services products. So I got to manage an engineering team and a product team and operations folks and really like run the business. And I really enjoyed that experience. But at the same time, like running a, quote unquote startup inside a large company isn't the same as running a real startup anymore, because Stripe was maybe 2,500 people at that time. And so from there, I went to Notion to lead the platform and partnerships efforts there. And my rationale there was that I was actually an investor in Notion, maybe about a year and a half or so before I ended up joining full time. So kind of got to see the company from the outside. There were a few ex-Stripe folks who were there, which was also appealing to me because I was interested in working with them again. And I wanted to kind of make that jump between kind of the middle management layer, which is where I was at Stripe, to more of the leadership team layer, which I could do at Notion. And then when I got to Notion, I was working on all sorts of stuff. I helped start the growth team at the company, hired our first PM, helped hire our head of people. It's a small company that needed to like get off the ground. So we needed to fill all these really great roles. And I was really enjoying that. But eventually I realized that Notion was actually like quite similar to Stripe, which is good for Notion, but I think was less of the completely new learning experience for me, which is what I was looking for in the next opportunity. So eventually I said, well, do I want more variety? Do I want more learning? Do I want to spend more time with even earlier stage startups? Maybe. So I decided to, hop off the Notion train, continue to support them as an investor, and then eventually, start doing a lot more of my own investing and advising in startups. And so we'll see how that goes. But it's also, I think everyone kind of deserves the opportunity to take a step back and, try to figure out what they really want to do in life. And so that's kind of what this opportunity is for me.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. It's so useful to hear how you thought about each jump. And, because at least what I've done in the past is when I was wanting to go on a certain path, I would basically stalk people's LinkedIn profiles for the people who've already done that path. And I'd be like, well, why do they make this decision? Why do they make that decision? And so it's useful to hear, it's a good reminder that a lot of these decisions, there's so much that goes into it. It's so much unique to each situation, because of the path that you've taken, because of probably, the decisions you made even when you were in college and even afterwards led you to have this meeting with the Stripe CEO, and then, led you to the other path. And then even how you thought about, okay, I want to move from middle management to more leadership team. So thanks for sharing that. I'd love to dig in more about you at work now. So how would your colleagues describe you as a leader?
I would say I'm a get things done individual, run through walls type of person. So I think it's more of a, okay, if you give this to Cristina, she's gonna handle it. I think that was the impression that I gave off. when I was interviewing and people were doing like these back channel references on me at Notion and at one other company I was considering, they were like, "We've heard you're intense." So like I still remember that, and I was like, yeah, like I think that's probably right. So yeah, I like to work hard. I like to get things done. And I really care about users and people. And I think that's driven a lot of my decisions. So yeah, that's me.
I love that. I love that around, how people describe you as intense and you're like, yeah, that's me. And the reason why I call it out is because so often in a Sense leadership program, I hear from a lot of the women, like, how do I balance being direct and a good leader or being nice and effective leader? And I love that call out because, that's not a bad thing as long as you balance that with, caring about your team, caring about your customers. And over the past few years, your name has randomly come up to me from like other people, and I forget which context it was in, but it's always like, Christina's awesome. Christina is just like someone that you can really rely on. Christina like crushes it. And so it's helpful getting to get more visibility into like how people would describe you. And it's just like calling out to other people, you can be intense, you can get things done. And that's like a requirement of the job. And you can also, and that doesn't mean that you're not a great leader. Actually, that's actually part of what makes you a really, really great leader.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of our brand is essentially our reputation at work. You have a really magnetic brand. Like I said, like your name has come up many times and people are like, Cristina is amazing. How have you thought about creating your brand? What are actions that you've taken to deliberately build the brand that you want to be seen as?
So I would say I hate this first part because it sounds really trite, like the whole like be helpful thing. But I always look at it as like this is an extremely small industry, tech, right? Like, to your point of like everyone kind of knows each other, if you've been in this industry long enough. And so I always think it's a good thing, to be helpful to people because I think, one, this is an industry that's very small. Two, it's an industry of a lot of like newcomers and people who are starting things for the first time who don't have a lot of experience. And like, I remember like reaching out to people cold when I was, just coming into this industry, and people would respond to me and get back to me. And I always really appreciated that. And so I look at it in more of like a giving back type of way. Like, what are the people out there? What are they building? What are they doing? Like, how can I be of help in any way? Whether it's like an introduction or like sharing a little bit more about my experience. This in and of itself is that, right? And so I very much look at it as, are there ways that I can be helpful? And then those people are often people who are like, of the next generation coming around building really great things, and might, have something to offer you at some point, right? So I very much look at it from that perspective and try to have just like an optimism about it, which I think I really learned from my experience at Stripe and just seeing all of these like founders, building their businesses and just having this like amazing optimism about the world and like you wanting to see them be successful. So I think part of it is that, and just, me, whether it's like one-on-one or like if I see someone doing really great work, like I really like cheering them on. And in an industry which I think deserves a lot of scrutiny at this point, I think optimism can be really helpful, and it's something I've learned, and I wasn't always that way at the beginning of my career. Second, I would just say focus on the things that like you're good at, and figure out where you think you can add value to a conversation, to a community, etc. And I don't claim to be someone who is great at building infrastructure or being an engineer. It's like I took 2 computer science classes in college, so I'm not going to tell you how to like build your product, but I will tell you if I think the experience is good, or if there are elements of it that I think could be improved. And I look at that very much as just being invested in people. So from a brand perspective, I look at it as like, how can I engage with people with like where they're at? So, whether it's Twitter or LinkedIn or what have you, I like to have a lot of conversations with people, and, less using these forums as a way to like shout out into the void, and more to like engage with people and have conversations, and like learn. And I think people appreciate that a lot, because it feels like you're like a real human being behind the, your icon and your photo, versus, someone who is just like this kind of like classic, tech, unreal person in a way. And so, where I can be, I try to focus on that. And I've also learned, I'd say over the years, to try and be a little bit more like vulnerable. And I think you realize that, people enjoy that much more than the like person who feels like they can do everything and knows what they're doing all the time.
Yeah, I love all that, especially around that vulnerability piece. I know for me, the longest time I thought vulnerability was a weakness. And even as a leader, I felt like I had to come across as really strong and be like, I'm not stressed about this, even though I was stressed about this. And for me, it was such a turning moment when I was able to make to my team, like, yeah, I am stressed about this. Here's how I think we can like move forward with it. They just trusted me so much more. And that's something I've really appreciated about you. I mean, all the stuff you're saying, like, I 100% believe because I've seen you embody it. And even, when you're tweeting, like, you don't have to share the things that, like, you don't have to be vulnerable, but you choose to be because you like are caring to give back. And I really love that. As I've touched upon, like, you have a great reputation and you have really built such an authentic brand. And sometimes we can do everything in our power to show up well, but we can still encounter bias. Have you ever gotten feedback that you thought was biased? And how did you handle it? What advice would you have for us in these kind of situations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think there's a lot of feedback out there that is like poorly worded. So for example, the first manager I had at Stripe for like, 6 years or so when I was there, gave me feedback about being vulnerable, for example. And it was something that like, I very much took to heart. And then I had a different manager who will go unnamed, later on, who, I was on parental leave. And, I got like this notice from Workday in my inbox that was like, your review is ready. And I was like, oh, I didn't think I was getting a review because I'm on parental leave. And I look at the review and I'm like, I have like baby in the arm and I'm like looking at this like Workday hellish portal in the other screen, and I see that I got this like tiny review, like of like a paragraph, where my manager at the time said that I was like being too clinical, which at the time felt very like very sharp elbow and just not necessarily something that was oriented around actually making me improve or giving me some way to like get around that. And it was something that, I think at the time I took pretty negatively. And I also had another experience where, effectively I got some feedback that was like, oh, you need to be like, less of the doctor no, kind of describing all the ways that this can go wrong or this isn't going to work. And what I found is that like, if I just was quiet more often, I tended to get better feedback. So, at the end of the day, it like translated to me into like, be quiet and you kind of like know your place effectively. And so there were a couple of like instances like that where I felt like, I certainly got feedback that didn't, particularly feel like that my best interest was put first, or that was communicated in a way, like you could give the exact same feedback in a way that doesn't feel biased. I think the care in giving that kind of feedback is really important. And I take that super seriously as like a manager and a leader. And, when it doesn't happen to you, that same care, it's obviously tough. So.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. That I can completely see, like, that's really hard to get, and just like, what the heck, as you're going through it. And I think we have a question from the chat from Cynthia, which like really relates perfectly to what we're talking about right now, where her question is like, what advice would you have for women, or we can make this more general, like anyone who are intense and don't want to have bias against them for not being nice? Mm-hmm. Like, how do you balance being direct or quote unquote intense without alienating others, intimidating others. I imagine a part of this like care that you're just mentioning comes into it. Like what other advice would you have for us to balance that being intense, being like just go getter, getting things done while still being seen without alienating others, intimidating others?
Yeah. Yeah. I think there was one moment where I think, I really focused in on like, caring is about giving feedback to others. And if you like bite your tongue, you're doing that person a disservice, right? And so I look at it as like, it has to come from a place of like, you understand this person as a human being, you've invested in these people. So when I think about, the relationships I built over my career, there are relationships I look back on and I say like, oh, like I could have done a better job there in terms of really understanding that person as a human being, spending time with them, and a lot of that is like work outside of work, grabbing lunch with people, getting coffee, like spending time with them outside of the office, like all those kinds of things where, even if this person, doesn't strike you as someone who is like obviously your best, your work best friend or whatever. But like, that person, is going to be valuable for you in getting things done. And like, it's important that that person sees you as a friend before, they see you as, someone who might be an adversary in the future. Right. So like really investing in building those relationships first and foremost, before you need something from someone, before, anything happens. I think that's super useful. And I think that's true of like your reports. Like, so I tried to make as many efforts as possible to like, take my team out of the office, like, go on, things that felt like bonding events or something to that effect. And also spend more time with people one-on-one and really understand them as human beings. Like if you don't know someone, like the name of someone's spouse or their kids, like, do you really know them? So really like invest in that first and foremost. And then I think when there is something that you need or like tough feedback that you want to give that maybe doesn't feel so nice, one, I think you'll be more conscious about how to give it in a positive way because you'll feel like this person is more of a human being than they felt beforehand. And two, you can give it in a way that's like, hey, I like saw this happen in a meeting, and I think it could have been better handled if it was approached like this. And coming from a place that is really oriented around trying to make that person succeed, because I always look at it as like their success is your success, is the company's success, right? So it mattered more that like everybody at Stripe was doing well, because when the company succeeds, everybody succeeds, versus trying to push people out of the way because you're trying to get ahead or something like that. And so I look at it as like, I want everyone to feel like I'm nice in a way, but at the same time, like I am also someone who's going to get things done. And so I don't think you can be so nice where like you end up not giving feedback to people, not pushing them, because then that's not to the benefit of everybody else, and is mostly defeating at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I completely agree with you. And when you don't get the feedback, you're actually hurting that person. You're not giving them the opportunity to grow and not have visibility. And I love what you're calling right now, and that's a mindset shift. Going in and viewing it not, I think so often when we get feedback, we view it like us against that person, when it's actually, no, you're on the same team. You're both trying to work towards the same goals, the company goals, your team goals, and you're just giving them feedback to help them succeed, but also you succeed. And so how do you deliver that in a way that doesn't make them feel attacked and actually makes them feel like she's just looking out for me? And this is coming from a good place. And that care that you're talking about is so important. And so often I hear like, but I'm really busy, I don't have time to go for a coffee chat, or I don't have time for the conversation. And I spend so much time explaining to our members, it's like a lot of times it's like, but this is actually the stuff that helps you be successful. So when you go ask your team, or you go ask a cross-functional partner to help you on a project, if you already have that rapport, then they're more likely to say yes to you.
Yeah. And speaking of the male versus female thing here, like, that like the guy on your team that might be a peer to you is like, asking people to like go play golf or grab drinks or, whatever it might be. And, if you're not doing that, then you are in the position that is like less favored over time, right? And so, find what's going to work, whether it's like, oh, like this person really likes to go running. I like to go running. Let's do something. And you can find those ways of like building those relationships, in environments that don't necessarily have alcohol around them or, feel very male dominated. And like, I would highly encourage people to take advantage of that when you can.
Yeah, I love that. What are some of the things that you've done right now in the remote world?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think when I can meet in person, like I've done a lot of walks, like a walk through Golden Gate Park or, around a particular neighborhood, so if I can make it in person, like I will try to. Otherwise, I just try to stay on top of people, like, having people like available on text message, I think is like the best thing ever. Actually, Stripe has a really great like X Stripe network that's on Slack. I am like, just, I'll like think about someone or they'll like tweet something and I'll just like DM them on Slack on like the X Stripe network or something like that. Or like text message someone, something that like reminded me or like, oh, I met this person and they said really great things about you. Like, kind of keeping those like light touches with people, I think is really important so that, it's not like you go, 6 years, 8 years without talking to someone and then you ask for something, right? That's like less than ideal. And like people will remember, those things and they like add up to feelings about you. And, I think a lot of my work friends ended up becoming my personal friends for this reason. And, when you can make that happen naturally, it's really great.
Yeah, I love that. I love all those tips. And yeah, sending those text messages is actually so simple. If you just build a habit around it, it takes 5 minutes and it carries a lot of weight. It's so thoughtful. When I get a random message from someone, I'm like, that was so sweet. And it makes me feel more connected to them.
Yeah.
And I would have otherwise. And so we've been talking a little bit about, these difficult situations, these biases. Let's talk about how to collaborate with difficult stakeholders. That's a big topic that we talk about in the leadership program, especially around personalities who don't take our ideas seriously, or maybe they say no without clear reasons. I'm sure you've had to navigate this many times because your role is essentially like working with different teams and getting buy-in. So what are a couple of actions that you've taken to get buy-in from difficult stakeholders?
Yeah. I think the first thing is like managing yourself almost, because there have been times when I've been like, in a mood to get someone on my side. And I've been in a mood to just be like, why isn't this easier? Why is this such a pain? And like, why do I even have to convince this person that this is the right thing? This is obviously the right thing. So, one, like manage yourself and get yourself in a mindset that like, you may not understand this person's motivations. You may not understand a bigger like context, like things that they've agreed to with other people, promises that they've made, those kinds of things. And I think that's helpful in understanding, trying to get compromises and make things happen for you or for your team. So that would be one. I would say two, really focus on not just the person that you're trying to convince, but the people around that person. So like one thing that I found to be helpful is like, for example, if there's a particular senior person I'm like trying to convince of something, I would actually go to their reports and be like, hey, like I'm trying to convince, Alice, that we should really like invest 3 more engineers in this product. And I think that could really accelerate our work. Like, do you have any thoughts about like what might be going on or like why they might be opposed to this idea, like anything that could be helpful? So maybe that can like help you get into their mindset, in advance and understand like what works for someone, because like what works to, for example, there were like leaders I've worked with where it's like, oh, a 6-page memo is the thing that's going to convince this person, like scheduling a meeting and putting together a memo and like having a pre-read session and discussing it, like can really convince them. And then for someone else, it's the random lunch and super casual, like asking for a favor type of conversation, right? So figuring out what works with the particular leader I think is really critical. And then rallying the people who might be peers to that person. So if you can get other people to kind of do your work for you so that everyone's kind of talking about this, like, oh, like Christina's working on this thing and I've heard so much about it. And then you go to that person last so that there's almost this like built up energy around what you're asking for. I think it's also really, really helpful. But also like, no, I've been in lots of conversations where people I'm like, oh, I need like 3 engineers for this, and I need 2 operations people and like another marketing person for this initiative. And I'm just like, oh, like you got to read the room. Like we're extremely resource constrained and this is just not going to happen. And it's not because your idea isn't good. It's just that like there are other things that are slightly more important. And like everything in the world that we have is like a stack rank at the end of the day. And this might be really good, but just not meet that bar. So realize when, it's time to kind of cut bait and like save a little bit of political capital and then like come back in 6 months or come back in 12 months with that, thought or idea or project that you want to pursue.
Yeah, I think that's such an important call out. When we get a note or idea, we feel like, oh, it was stupid or we take it personally, but you're right. It's not usually about you. It's just like there's other parties going on or people have different other things. And I really also love the call out around leveraging others. So often we feel like we need to go do it all ourselves, but that's actually not even that effective. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter who had the idea. It's about who executed it and like getting things done.
Yeah, exactly. And I've been in rooms where it's like, oh, like I really have this opinion, but like I'm coming with 2 other people, like the engineering lead for this other team and this other team. We all are on the same page. And so, it's not just me like throwing myself out there. It's like a group of people, right? So where you can do that, it's helpful.
Yeah, the power of social influence. The people are like, oh, okay, well, if they're on board, then I should listen to it even more closely.
Exactly.
Yeah, 100%. Let's dive into some of your failures. And because we often celebrate successes, but we don't share failures. And I love how you've really opened up to us in this conversation. And I think there's so many valuable tidbits. And I'd love to learn more about how have you learned how to like around failure in your career? Like what's failure in your career and what have you learned from it?
Yeah.
I think knowing how to overcome failure is actually really critical to success. We don't realize, like we don't talk about it. And I want to like help people see how you have had a failure in your career and like what have you learned from it? How have you grown?
Yeah. I've learned that, failure is like very normal. And like a lot of really great leaders have had failures in their history. Like as an example, like Google basically has this like bench of people who are all like VPs, but they're not actually like working on anything. And then they get called in for like an emergency, effectively, like a new product initiative that needs a leader or what have you, but they may have like failed in another previous areas. And that's why like they're on the bench, but like Google knows they're still good people and is going to put them, into another area that's really critical for the company over time. So like, when you hear about stories that exists, it's just like, I see, like, companies ultimately need to take risks, and not all of those risks are going to work out. So I'll maybe talk about a time when I was at Stripe, and I was maybe like 3 years in or something like that to the company, and we had started working on a product for social commerce that would basically enable a given business to sell their products on like Twitter and Pinterest and Facebook and all these different places. And it was a product called Relay. You probably haven't heard of it because it doesn't really exist anymore. And we built that product and it had like this huge partnerships component because we had to get all of these like social networks to kind of buy into the product. And I think the tough part about that product was that we realized only after having built it and kind of brought it to market that I think a lot of the stakeholders in play, whether it was the social networks or the stores or whatever, didn't necessarily think that this like full-fledged attribution for, when you click on an ad and you go to a website, for example, you may not actually go ahead and buy that product. And they tell you like, it takes 7 times to like see an ad before you actually buy something. And now that you can actually, in some cases, click on an ad and buy within the ad itself, which is what we were trying to build, a lot of that rationale for like, oh, they'll buy it later. They just didn't want to buy it at that at that particular instance kind of goes out the window. So all of these players weren't really aligned, and we were building, you know, a product that relied on having everybody aligned. And so that was, I think, the most difficult part when we realized that we were just like really pushing for some of these partners to kind of make it work. And it worked with a couple of them, but it didn't work with enough of them. And therefore the like network didn't really play out. And so having to go through like, you know, first putting that on, you know, on ice, as they call it at tech companies, like, you know, kind of keep the lights on type of mode. And then working to like actually like shut some elements of the product down. Like, you know, those were certainly hard things to work on. And, you know, I found that one of the things that, you know, I compared that launch experience to from my time at Stripe was actually a different product called Stripe Connect, which now makes up like a very significant portion of Stripe's business. You know, we had customers that loved the product from the get-go and, you know, weren't necessarily in it for the like FOMO of like, oh, what if I miss this social commerce boat, which is how it felt like with the Relay product. There was just like a clear customer demand and need for the product with something like Connect. And so I think it's easy to say like, oh, we've launched these partnerships, we got these customers, like that means we're doing well. But, you know, I think what I learned from that is that there's a difference between, you know, being, you know, 10x beyond what someone expected and, you know, something that's really changing the market versus something that people feel like kind of obligated to participate in so that they don't miss out. And so I always try to like hold on to that. It's like, oh, do you like this product, but do you love it? You know, and there's a big difference between liking a product and really loving a product.
For sure. Yeah, that's great. I love how you just shared like the example of when it did work and when it didn't, and to like really highlight that comparison around it. Last question for you before we close out. There's a question in the chat around what is your tip for women on how to advance from mid-management to senior or executive level?
Mm-hmm. So I would say it depends on the company. So I think it depends on where the company is in their journey. For example, if you are, you know, someone who's like joining Google now, for example, like I think it's a tough road to get from like middle management to upper management for the same reason I described earlier. It's like you have a lot of people who are on the bench who are already at that level who can get pulled into initiatives versus like pulling someone from middle management up. So that makes things a lot harder. I think my best advice is to join a super high growth company because that company will have a lot of spots open. You know, just as I mentioned, it's like, oh, like when I joined, Notion didn't have like a head of people or any product managers or any of these things. Like we needed to build out the entire like executive leadership bench. And so there was a ton of executive recruiting. And I think we were doing that both from the inside and also, you know, promoting some people into roles over time, and then also hiring from the outside. So, you know, find a high growth company where there are more slots open to potentially get to that next level. And then, you know, have lots of conversations with people about what your ambitions are and get a sense of whether your ambitions are realistic. I think, you know, one of the things that I, you know, enjoyed doing at Stripe was just to have really frank conversations about like how the work of the team was growing with what I was building and how we were going to need more people to take on that work. And, you know, just putting myself out there as like someone who wanted to build that team or start this new venture and having those conversations. At one point, maybe 3 or 4 years into my time at Stripe, I was like, oh, like I'd really like a GM role. And that was something that I was really interested in. And my manager at the time said like, well, like we don't have business units, like we don't operate like Amazon, you know? And, you know, a few years later, the company did. And so that, I think, for me was, a really great moment, to realize that, like, I'd actually been working toward that moment for several years, and the company kind of knew what my ambitions were, and I just kind of had to wait for that right opportunity, to open up. And then there are other times where, like, I think you should be able to have frank conversations with the manager and have the manager say, like, oh, like, that's a role that we're going to look for someone with like 10 more years of experience for. And, like, I want to be realistic that that's not possible for you. And, like, I've had to have some of those conversations with people, and they're really tough because it feels like you're boxing them in. But I think it's really helpful to be clear with people as to, like, where you think they're going within a company, and, like, how long they have to be there, and, like, what skills they have to show to be ready for that next step. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. Thanks for sharing that and like walking through that. I think, and even like just like making sure you communicate to people what you want, because otherwise people often assume that you don't want it, even though it might be obvious to you. Like, of course I want to get promoted. Of course I want to take up more of a leadership role. This has been all so good. There's so many good nuggets that you shared with us today. And I want to make sure, in a sense, we're all about action and like really applying things. So for all of you listening in, throw in the chat, what's a takeaway or one thing you want to remember from our conversation? Cristina and I talked about how she's thought about creating your brand, what her leadership style is, how do you respond to biased feedback, working with difficult stakeholders, moving into management, dealing with failure. So throw in the chat, what's your favorite takeaway or something that you really want to remember from today's conversation? Giving feedback that's helpful to the person receiving it, building relationships early on. Love the advice on how to develop relationships with your team. Great insight in moving your career, making choices and trusting yourself. I love all these. These are all so good. Building momentum around an idea, improvement to get buy-in. Yeah. Be honest in awkward situations, for sure. Care and giving, crafting feedback. Yeah, I think that's one of my favorites too, around, just showing that care, coming in, you're all on the same team. How to move up, the little touch points when people matter, stakeholder buying circles. So many good takeaways. Cristina, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing all your experience and insights. It was so helpful, so important. So thank you, Cristina.
Yeah, of course. Happy to. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. And for all of you, if you really enjoyed today's conversation and you want to start developing the skills that we talked about today around how to build your brand, how to influence, rally stakeholders, and you want to do it while you're part of a like-minded community of women, then you should definitely come join us in Ascend's leadership program. The program starts on November 1st. We already have a wait list. So Lilia will drop the link in the chat. You can put your name on the wait list if you want to be notified when enrollment opens up. We have just an amazing group coming in. We will send out the recording from today's conversation so you can go back, re-listen to it, share it with your friends. Cristina, thank you again. This was super fun. Lots of really good insights, and really it was so helpful just hearing how you think about things and how you've managed your career, which has been a very impressive career. Everyone, thank you so much for joining. Hope you're enjoying the summer. Stay safe and well, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Take care. Bye.
Bye.